Hi, welcome to the special meeting of Brisbane Planning Commission, Tuesday, February 2nd, 2016, 7:30 p.m., Brisbane City Hall, 50 Park Place, Brisbane.
Commissioner Anderson?
Present.
Commissioner Doe?
Present.
Commissioner Manier?
Here.
Commissioner Reinhardt?
Here.
The record show Commissioner Parker is absent.
Okay. May we have a motion to adopt the agenda, please?
I make a motion to adopt the agenda.
I'll second that.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. So at this time, we would like to have oral communications for anyone who would like to address the Commission on issues not on the agenda. No? Okay, we'll move forward. Written communications. I think each of us have received an invitation to a dinner that is being hosted by Sustainable San Mateo County. Any other written communications we'd like to share? Okay. Thank you. Old business. Brisbane's Bayland applications, Baylands concept plans, Brisbane Baylands-Specific Plan, General Plan, Amendment Case GP-01-06, and related final environmental impact report. Universal Paragon Corporation applicant, owners various, APN various. And tonight we're having a presentation by Commissioner Anderson.
That looks good from here. Yep. Good. So my name is Greg Anderson. I think most of you know me already. In the interest of time, I'm going to try and speed through as much of this as I can. After I'm all done, we'll have more discussion with the rest of the members. The purpose of this presentation is to organize information. The reason I built this is I wanted to draw a box around the things that we needed to deliberate on. Nothing in this presentation should be considered decision-making. This is a presentation about what we need to make decisions on. Ultimately, it's going to be the Planning Commission that makes all of the decisions on the issues before us. And in order to make that decision, they're relying on us to provide them with information. So it's my feeling that the recommendation we make is not as important as the underlying reasons for that recommendation, and hence this organization. When I was going through the information, in my mind, I find it difficult to think of a topic and find all of the information that applies to it. So I've laid out this presentation is pretty much my note-taking for my pre-deliberations, and I laid it out in the order that topics were referred to in the Brisbane General Plan, and added a couple of things after that for topics that didn't fit into those categories. And then I went through all of the information linearly, applying this as a filter and dropping the information in where it belongs. And that's how all of this came together. So to keep myself organized, I color-coded the slides. The green slides are reference to things that are said somewhere else. These are not necessarily truth or beyond debate, but it goes without saying that someone said this somewhere else, and I reference my references. A side point is something that I just wanted to bring up for a discussion. And the yellow slides are things that are still questionable. I had a lot of these to start with, but thanks to some meetings with staff and Lloyd, most of these yellow slides became other colors, which was great. And the key to all of this are the red slides, and these are the items for deliberation. It says recommendation here, but that's not really correct. Our goal is to come to a recommendation on these slides, but my high school English teachers wouldn't let me write everything in the form of a question. I had to write it more in the imperative. So it drove me crazy to do it the other way, but don't be confused by that. It wasn't my intention. So here's the disclaimer. These are items to be discussed, not recommendations. In our last meeting, Chairperson Doe read the advice from legal counsel that the Planning Commission has closed public testimony, and we're not required to take any more. We have found public testimony to be extremely helpful in this process, and we will probably open the floor most meetings, but please bear in mind that we are asking for your help to organize the information. This section is not for public debate. We'll be here forever. It's the Planning Commission that's going to be making the decision, so if you disagree with decisions we make, please write the Planning Commission. If you see us forgetting to talk about something, please let us know right away. So Brisbane has a wonderful general plan, and I think you've had a chance to read what it says about it. The general plan itself says that it should be reviewed in the year of 2004, which is a long time in the past. But in a recent meeting with staff, we discussed this, and apparently the trend in cities is to not redo their general plan every 10 years because that's very expensive. And I think that the process we're going through now, and also the process of making the sustainability framework for Brisbane, is, in a way, a fulfillment of the 1994 desire to revisit the general plan. But that said, we have to examine everything here, and although we are examining everything, I would not come to the conclusion that things are going to be vastly different than the general plan. From most of the testimony we've heard, it seems that the city still feels the same way predominantly as they did in 1994. Another interesting point is that a general plan vote is not required for adoption, but one thing we've heard over and over again is that the citizens of Brisbane are very much tied in to the fate of the city, and many people would like to see any substantive issues come to a vote. So it's Brisbane's goal to allow people, the public, or the use of their property, but public health and safety is a key part of this. So I'm getting right into one of my most important issues right off, and that is that a lot of the material that we've encountered in the DEIR and the FEIR completely follows what's expected of CEQA, but I don't feel that it always provides the information that we need to make a decision, because those two things are a little bit different. CEQA only requires that you do what the process is laid out in terms of study and discovery, but sometimes I think that we need to go beyond CEQA in order to make a good decision about what's going to happen in the Baylands. The key issue in front of everyone is housing on the Baylands. This is a very difficult site to place housing, and anything that happened that had any sort of use like that, where the public could spend a lot of time in contact with areas that were remediated, we have to make sure that those remediated areas are extremely safe. And one thing that I have found missing is really good comparative case studies of other sites similar to the Baylands that have been successfully remediated. Now, we've had many candidate sites shown to us as potential comparative sites to the Baylands, but we haven't seen a lot that are really, really similar and also have a really long history. Recently, we received from the applicant 10 case studies, which I thought were very interesting to read, and some of them had some strong parallels, like the Jewish Community Center, which was primarily an assisted living facility, and also Mission Bay has a lot of similarities. But the thing about Mission Bay is that it's not even finished yet, and all of these sites that were presented are predominantly under 10 years old or predominantly commercial. And I think that the commercial examples that were given to us are probably pretty good, reliable examples of things that we might be able to expect to be able to do in the commercial district. But I really feel that we could use more case studies of a longer duration in terms of being able to really say anything about housing. That is, of course, it's always possible for us to draw the process short and say, okay, well, we're just not going to accept housing at all. But many years ago, the Brisbane City Council came to the decision to say, okay, let them study it. So, I feel an obligation to be as thorough as possible, or all of this time and expense, it's for naught. So, yes. I'm just skipping over some of these things. I imagine that you've read it, and I do not have time to discuss everything. There are certain uses that have already been laid out for the land in the Baylands, listed here. And it's also interesting that the general plan lists a number of potentially appropriate uses, such as retail, offices, recreational facility, research development, education. None of these are actually approved yet, but they're called out as things for future study, which is part of what leads us here today. So the current plan has a lot of parks, and the Brisbane general plan calls for open areas, and this is something that's largely desired, but we don't want to gloss over the issue of safety and focus only on housing. We need to make sure that all of these areas are going to be adequately remediated for their potential use. And also I mentioned this in our last meeting related to the lagoon. I think that we need to have some deliberation over the appropriateness of recreation in that area. The lagoon, in many cases, was not studied as much as other areas because, almost paradoxically, you can't modify the lagoon. So in some cases, the hydrology water monitoring and so on is a little reduced there. So, if we are going to consider doing things like putting a wharf out there or putting anything close to it, or even putting a park there that might increase use, then I think we need to deliberate not just the impacts of that, but in terms of what changes that's going to make in terms of monitoring and studying that area. So preserving the site. We talked about the Roundhouse Spur line in our last meeting as well, and I'll just say, to recap, that it's something that's highly desired, but we have the question of appropriate adjacent uses. So that's something we'll probably have to spend a fair bit of time on later. Establishing height limits, of course, has been a very vigorous topic of discussion during public input. The wind speed study was requested. I think we should discuss to what extent we would like to see more data there. The computer modeling that was requested sounded very valuable. And of course, many people have called to attention the high-speed rail. It's an interesting situation here because, while some have called this plan speculative, it has to be, at this point, somewhat speculative because HSR can't come to a final determination as to their land use until they're finished with their EIR. And they even sent us a letter saying, that they wanted us to proceed in advance of this. But, as far as process is concerned, that's really necessary to not get these different tasks blocked on each other. But at some point in the near future, they are going to finish their EIR. And there's a really good chance that they're going to want to use some of this land. So, it's my opinion that it would be very prudent, since we are talking about a 20-some-year process of build-out and only a 2-year process or so before the HSR comes around, with their desires made known, that we consider that. Circulation element. This is one of the areas that I had the most trouble in the DER. I've got some diagrams here for references about proposed roadways, and an interesting note that spot widening through the Baylands was said to not solve congestion problems. So, our main congestion is on 101 and Bayshore, and getting traffic to flow through there. This was also talked about in the previous message. Lanes dedicated to the bus can help, but sooner or later the bus is going to be on the same road as all of the cars. Other countries are doing interesting things like elevating bicycle paths to get people commuting by other means away from the cars, which I think is an interesting thing to look at. And bicycling is actually starting to take off in this area. There's a program for the bike share program that's been very popular. I see a lot of people riding these bikes in San Francisco, and they're expanding all around. The applicant's plan already has provisions for bicycles, which I think is great. The Bay Trail point I'm going to skip past. But the other thing I wanted to bring up, it's a little off topic in a way, but the original Bart Map from the 50s has much greater coverage than what we actually enjoy today. And, every time I see this, I just wonder what we could have done differently to let this come to pass. The reason I put this in here, even though it's out of our control completely, is that if we had something like this, with maybe even at this late date, we could put in some of these BART lines elevated above the roads or above the train tracks. This sort of thing would increase the capacity of the site in the way that extra traffic lights and timing and road widenings just can't, because we're already getting pretty close to the limit of what we can put in here. But at this point, my analysis of traffic is incomplete, because I found that the EIR traffic conclusions are incredible, and it's just difficult to tell if they're incredibly good or just incredible, because they're very difficult to understand, and even the expert witness who came in couldn't really tell us anything about standard deviation or anything about these numbers. And I've tried to work it out myself, and I'm pretty good with numbers, but I just haven't cracked it open yet. So I'm not sure what this means for our deliberations. This is one of those areas where I feel like the traffic study is probably adequate under CEQA. If you look really strictly at what CEQA requires, they followed their procedures, they chose some numbers arbitrarily, they came up with some results. I just don't know if those results are useful as a comparative analysis between the DSP and the CPP, because I think that many of those results are more likely to be driven by arbitrary decisions that went into the numbers that are too hard for me to analyze, to say for sure. But it's just my suspicion. But I do think that what we know so far about traffic is that we know it's going to be a lot more, and we know that transit-oriented will help a lot, and so we can go from first principles. I really think that we're going to have to decide how much more effort we want to throw at this traffic thing, because it's kind of a Gordian knot. One thing I would like to see more of is a connection between central Brisbane and the new development. And one of the presentations in public testimony had a good idea about road connection through the location of the firehouse. I don't know how feasible it is to move the firehouse, but that seemed like a really good idea. And anything that could get people from this side to that side, like bike and pedestrian trails either under the bridge or an overpass over Bayshore, or something like that. Thinking more not just about the site, but the connection, because this is an important part of the Brisbane General Plan, is to stay connected. And I think of Onramp at Sierra Point would be grand in terms of things we could actually do. There's a lot of things we can't do about traffic, but I think this is one more thing that we could do for people at that junction, going all the way down to the Sierra Point offices in order to go northbound there is too arduous. Most people just get on Bayshore, and that makes Bayshore really impacted. This is also really going to depend on what sort of uses we have in the Baylands. I've always thought that since it's sort of an industrial site, and we always have people looking to bring freight forwarding into Brisbane, either in Crocker or BWR or places that impact Brisbane. I meant to say Bayshore Boulevard, which is already very impacted. If we could somehow locate businesses like that inside of the landfill site east of the railroad in a place that gives the trucks easy direct access to the freeway, I think that would be a great benefit. Easier said than done. Getting the crossing of everything connected through the Geneva extension and Recreational and all of that stuff, it all interrelates, and it's hard to just say, let's put an HSR here or a solar farm there. It has to all get shifted around. But another off-ramp on the other side of the site, I think, would really help alleviate some of those interdependencies and give us more flexibility. Open space. Yes, so we've got this notion in the general plan it's very focused on central Brisbane and keeping the view lines low so that people can see the water. But getting back to what was said earlier about the wind and the larger buildings being more northbound, I think that we should consider, I don't know if tall buildings are something that we would want to recommend as allowable on the landfill site at all. That's a different topic that we have to deliberate on, but if we did, it seems to me that we might want to consider the trade-off of putting one of those more in the southerly areas, maybe blocking a little bit of the views, but giving more of a wind corridor for the windsurfers. I've already talked about the maintaining connections versus remaining distinct, and pulling development south is what I was just referring to. Not necessarily an easy decision because it has that trade-off, but something to consider. We read this last time, and we've also talked a lot about the difference between open space and open areas. It seems that if an open area is publicly owned, it is possible that it can go bankrupt or be sold. It can't be redeveloped into any other purpose unless it's rezoned, so that would take a different action of the city council. We've got to define what policies are going to protect these open spaces, both in terms of zoning and financial, which of course financial we haven't seen yet. And that's natural because I think we have to get through land use determinations before anyone's going to go to that much detail on calculations of what things are cost. Yes, the rail line cuts right through the middle. There are portions in the EIR that talks about maintaining connections between the two sides. I see 2 bridges and a pedestrian overpass in the road map that I had earlier. But parts of the EIR talked about wildlife crossings, and I don't know if that means that you just let the bunnies run across the tracks or whatever. But that's a difficult thing to do because, you know, the tracks are there and wildlife doesn't know how to make use of the overpasses. We do have the creek area, but that's more southerly. So I think this is an area that's going to take some difficult analysis to see the connections are really acceptable. Noise and vibration is another area that I really feel that I haven't studied adequately. I think it's something that we as a group are going to have to really go over. I mean, it's obviously clear that there are going to have to be regulations and following the building codes and so on and so forth, because we're going to have 20 years of construction, and you know, we don't want the whole area to be uninhabitable for us, or even more so for the people up in Little Hollywood and Sunnydale. And the FEIR says construction noise will exceed city standards. So, you know, how are we going to mitigate that? It's really critical. I think, you know, a number of years ago, we had the pile driving for the railroad track extension that had to happen at night because the trains needed to use the tracks during the daytime. And fortunately, that was just a short period of time, but it was kind of difficult. I think we should consider noise mitigation measures along the lines of avoiding too many consecutive days of nighttime work. If there are any periods where we have to be outside of what's normally allowed, just in order to allow some part of the project to go forward, because it's difficult for people who have to live near it. Safety element. We got a lot of testimony about this, and I'm sure it's going to take a lot of time to go through it. I've got a lot of slides about it. I don't know that I'm going to spend a lot of time on it. I'm going to try and just rush through this area because I think we all understand how important it is to really study this. You know, there's a traffic and water treatment plant, and there's a thermal oxidizer there. I put construction impacts later. OU1, there's volatile organic compounds in OU1 by Dr. Fred Lee and in the DEIR. And there's hydrocarbons there per the DEIR on 4G48. OU2 is also said to have bunker C, VOCs, lead. The FEIR points out that the draft EIR does not assert that bunker C oil is completely insoluble or immobile. So this is an area of concern. We want all of this stuff to stay in place, and we're not just talking about staying in place for a week, but staying in place for decades. The other very interesting issue is that DTSC doesn't begin their process until land use determinations have been made. And the authority for the landfill closure does not lie with the City of Brisbane. That lies with the Regional Water Quality Board and DTSC. So we're going to need to put a landfill cover system in place, and there are standards for doing that, and RWQCB and DTSC are going to have the authority over putting that in place and determining safety and all of the things. So they are the regulatory agencies. That is what they do. We do remain capable of enforcing the level of remediation that is set by the regulatory agencies and can stop construction if there are concerns. But for a large part, we are going to be outside parties to this. So the question of higher cleanup standards, I've heard this said both ways. In the FEIR, it says that we can't require higher cleanup standards in the area of remediation unless we have substantial evidence demonstrating the need to do so. Other areas, I've often heard it said that the city has carte blanche to always require higher standards, but I think that's for areas where we are the agency of authority. So the official RAP process is rather short. It says that there's going to be public commentary in a 30-day period, and there'll be a summary, and the final RAP reflects changes that DTSC determines are appropriate. So we have input, but not necessarily control. We had a meeting with staff on this subject, and apparently, even though the city is not in control of the remediation, if we decide that the remediation is inadequate for a land use that we determined, that the city council determined was appropriate, we could circle back and remove the land use designation. And that's one bit of leverage we have to ensure that things are done to a standard that we approve of. But it seems like once we've made a land use determination, it would be difficult. It seems to me it would be difficult to go through that process. So I think it's very important for us to really figure out what the regulatory standards are and how comfortable we are with those regulatory standards, because it's not like we even feasibly could go down there and say, oh, it looks like they're putting in the cover right. We don't even have the experience to make that sort of determination. So we have to make really good decisions about what we're doing before we get to that point, which is, going back to my previous point that I think we really should consider case studies that are more than 20 years old involving housing that were remediated on similar large sites, over 1,000 units, and compare those and see how did they come about, which is a difficult thing, because if you go back too many decades, then you get to Love Canal and people that didn't remediate at all. But if you don't go back far enough, then we really don't have any data. So we're potentially in a situation where we don't have enough decision or enough data to make a good decision. And if it does come to that, my conclusion there is we're looking at a development process that's many decades long. I don't think that we need to hurry to allow additional land uses until we've got enough information to make that determination. And if that takes another 10 or 20 years for the other projects to become mature enough to become a comparison point, then so be it. But we should do what we can to see if there are existing sites that we can look at to give us more of a comparison. We know that the contaminants are dangerous. The effects of VOCs are not immediate. It takes a long time. And, cancer has been in the news a lot. If you just go on the internet and search, the lower left-hand portion of this chart is something you see a lot. It shows up everywhere that mortality is going down, and people people who are publishing and writing about cancer are calling a lot of attention to this decrease in mortality because, it's good news. But all the same, even though mortality is going down, rates are going up, and it's a lot harder to find data about rates that are going up or, rates in general. But the one thing that is in the news a lot is about predicted cases rising, and they say it's mostly hitting the elderly population, and so maybe that can be discounted a little bit in terms of people who have been around a long time have had more of a chance to be exposed. But we also have some studies that show that incidence of cancer are going up in children. So this just goes back to the point I was making earlier, that we're really concerned about the long-term effects of the remediation. The property might be 100% safe the day after it's built, but we're also concerned about what's going to happen 10 years after it's built, and 20 years after it's built, and 30 years after it's built. And, is there a point where, like a roof, you need a new roof? And what do you do if you need a new landfill barrier? That's something that I don't adequately understand yet. Legality does not guarantee safety. I wanted to make this point because, a lot of times we were advised that we need to trust the regulatory agencies, and, they're here to protect us, and these are the laws, and these are the standards, and because it's the law, it must be safe. But I'm going to make 2 points that are tangential to what we're studying tonight, and one is industrial pesticides. Nowadays, Roundup is the chemical of choice, but some years ago it was DDT, and that was, proven to be safe for humans. And I even heard anecdotally about a gentleman who put DDT on his cereal and ate it for breakfast every morning, just to make a point about the safety of pesticides. And yet, we have companies like Monsanto and their derivatives who purchase from them that use pesticides on an industrial level to the point where you can actually see the die-off from outer space, because they use billions of gallons of pesticides to kill everything. And then in the next year, they have to reinvigorate it with fertilizer. And then they do this over and over and over again with pesticides and fertilizer and pesticides and fertilizer. And while you can prove that it's safe on a small scale with the DDT in your breakfast cereal, it just defies explanation that you can use billions of gallons of poison every year and have that be something good to happen to your state. I think this is North Dakota. But it's all perfectly legal and within the rights of what the regulatory agencies allow. Fracking is another prime example. There's a lot of evidence that fracking is safe, and if you bring up videos of people's kitchen faucets, water catching on fire, then they say, oh, well, that was old fracking and new fracking is better. As far as I know, the chemicals they use are still protected under intellectual property laws because they don't want other frackers to frack better than they frack. So we don't even know what they're pumping in, and they say, oh, it's safe, it's not going to come out. But all of that stuff stays down there. And when you do fracking on an industrial level, then that's billions of gallons that's just going into the ground and staying there, and it's perfectly legal. So I respect DTSC and the Regional Water Quality Board, and I know we're all on the same page about protecting public health and safety, but when we're talking about remediating in place, and we know that these chemicals create VOCs, that they want to go up. I haven't even gotten to Love Canal yet. I think that's coming close. Yeah. As long as I'm talking about fracking and pesticides, I also want to talk about Love Canal. And I'm not saying that Baylands is going to come out the same way as Love Canal, but the interesting thing about Love Canal is they made no attempt to remediate whatsoever. And the problem that happened here is that when the water came in, and when the site filled up with water, then that brought everything to the surface. And I think it was Commissioner Parker a couple of meetings ago who said, we really have to come to a determination about, is the water going to go down or is the water going to go up? And in the short term, we can look at the hydrology and we say, the water is going down because gravity, and we see which direction it's flowing today. But with sea level rise and the fact that we know that the contaminants are already in contact with the water table, I just think it becomes really difficult to know what's going to happen if you have water coming up under the barrier, you have VOCs under the barrier that want to go up, and we don't know how well the barrier is going to do in terms of earthquakes or other effects that might crack it. What happens when you have a crack in the barrier? How close do we get to the Love Canal situation where we have large amounts of contaminants coming up? I mean, we presume that even the worst case scenario in the Baylands is going to be far better than Love Canal, but we don't want to get into that kind of scenario at all. So hydrology is just a very interesting question, and it's hard to predict what might happen. This is actually Dr. Fred Lee, who says that the land use has to be compatible, and we have concern for excavation and utilities and deep-rooted plants. I think the current specific plan does make a very good effort to avoid excavation, and I think that's a good start. There are some places where they're going down half a story, but hopefully that's mostly overfill. Pile driving is reportedly safe. I've heard they have techniques for driving the piles without letting things come up, but that's something we need to make sure is monitored. And but they're all engineering issues that aren't going to be clearly defined until the wrap, which is getting back to the early point that I think we need to make really good decisions in advance so that we're not surprised after the fact. Yes, and the spread of dust, there are mitigation measures preventing dust from coming out of the site into adjacent residential areas. Those are going to be extremely important. It's in the, well, we'll talk about that later. We have to talk about that a lot. And then the other question I have is trees. We had a fairly lengthy discussion during public testimony with one of the applicants' experts, and it said that the fill material is going to range from 7 to 10 feet in depth. Some of those trees look really big. I don't know that we have a good idea about how deep the roots are going to go and whether that's all going to be safe, because roots can go through concrete, and I don't think that there's a barrier that's going to stop the roots. So going to be very important to make sure that this is remembered. The landscaper doesn't go in and plant trees in an area where the dirt isn't deep enough to sustain it. So, what to do about this? The safest uses in the Baylands are those similar to what I have on the left side of this slide, things where people don't come in contact with the land. We do have R&D technology center, and retail is also a permitted use, but we have to really seriously consider housing or hotels and public parks. And interestingly enough, I don't think that Recreational is a permitted use under the general plan, but it must be a permitted use somewhere because it's there. So once we add land uses, it's really hard to take them back. We couldn't easily go and say, we don't want Recreational at all. So anything that we add is going to have lasting impacts. Earthquakes. We've had earthquakes ranging up to 8.0-ish in the past 100 years or so, but this site is, all of it is highly subject to liquefaction. So this map shows the areas that are at very high risk, which is essentially the entire site except for Ice House Hill. And earthquake potential, if there is a large earthquake, it could have rather strong effects. There was a 9.0 magnitude earthquake in Tohoku, Japan. We know that these happen in the world. They're fairly rare. It's a difficult point to deliberate what the appropriate earthquake standards are, because at a certain level, if you get to a high enough intensity earthquake, then nothing we build will withstand it. But there is a range there, since each point on the Richter scale is 10 times the magnitude, the difference between an 8.0 and an 8.1 and an 8.5 can be quite large, and the effects of a larger than anticipated earthquake in an area that's subject to very high liquefaction can be much greater than the effects of a slightly larger than expected earthquake in central Brisbane, where we're all on bedrock. So I think it would be highly prudent for us to push for higher standards of construction vis-a-vis the kind of earthquake that we want to protect against, even though it's not very likely that we will live to see such an event. It would just be rather horrific to live through it if it did happen. And I also thought that it would be very interesting to see what the building codes say about the San Francisco Marina, because that area recently did undergo a fairly significant earthquake and was significantly more damaged than the other areas. So, presumably San Francisco has some experience in adjusting building codes for areas that are subject to high levels of liquefaction. And then the perennial issue of how do you repair the landfill cover if it breaks underneath of a building or something like that. Staff has promised to look into the issue of the tsunami potential. There's an NOAA report that said 13 feet. The ABAG report was much smaller than that. Reportedly, maybe 13 feet was at the mouth of the bay. I don't know the answer to that, but we're going to get the answer to that later, because especially issues like Kinder Morgan, 13 feet on Kinder Morgan would be devastating. I don't think we necessarily need to plan for that, but we should know whether we're planning for 11 inches or something more than 11 inches. This is the ABAG map that shows 11 inches, which has very, very little impact on the site. And it would be interesting to know if Kinder Morgan has a tsunami disaster preparedness plan. It was almost a theme of the DEIR to say that Kinder Morgan is outside of the project area, but things outside of the project area can affect the project area, and even if CEQA does not require that to be studied, that's a very important thing for our decision-making process. As far as I can tell, the regulatory rules about things like Kinder Morgan are limited to just like a 1,500-foot setback, but considering that the containment tanks or reservoirs only hold about half the volume of what the tanks do, we might want to consider whether that's also an appropriate guideline for the area around Kinder Morgan and the Baylands. So fortunately, the tanks are predominantly, or I think perhaps all on bedrock, but still an area of concern. Hydrology, I've already touched on this. In terms of safety, California may be entering a mega drought phase of 30 years or more. This is a sustainability framework. It was recently brought up in our last meeting during public testimony that Oakdale and SFPUC have not come to an agreement, and in fact, in our last project, they said that the San Francisco Public Utility Commission has tabled the discussions with Oakdale. So can't build it without water, but that's going to have to happen one of these days. And I discussed topology and water runoff earlier. Leachate management is critical. Kinder Morgan, I discussed that. There are already known contaminants there. The San Francisco Regional Water Quality Control Board says that it is affecting lands outside of the boundaries of the Kinder Morgan site and in the area of the Baylands. And I don't know what their earthquake preparedness plan is. Here I took note somewhere that 1,300 feet is the limit. Other places I read was 1,500 feet. I think the packet we most recently received from the City Council said 1,500 feet. Housing element. There's a great shortage of housing in the Bay Area. We had a lot of public testimony about that, and I strongly feel that Brisbane should do what we can in reasonable quantities to provide housing in areas where it's safe to do so. It's going to be a large part of our deliberation process. But I don't have a lot about housing element right now. That's something we're going to have to go into in more detail later on in the deliberation process. A lot has been said about the sustainability framework. We had a 2x2 meeting with Cliff and Clark, and they said that the council really wants to use the sustainability framework as a framework for our deliberations, and I think that's great. There's a lot of talk about green building standards in the DSP specific plan, which is also great. It doesn't yet meet some of these requirements that are going to be California requirements by 2020 and 2030. So I think we really should take the sustainability framework's aspirational goals and consider how those can be a ramp, if not a bridge, to the requirements that we're going to have by the time that this project is finished. In the interest of time, I'm not going to harp on sustainability, but you can ask me about it sometime. The point here is that Brisbane, we want to take the definition of sustainability that makes sense for us, and there's a really good one in the sustainability framework, which I have on slide 114. I'm almost done. And I've mentioned this already. Sooner or later, everyone's going to have to adopt these requirements. Yes, so we have an alternative plan. Many people have written us letters in favor of the environmentally superior alternative, and the renewable energy plan is feasible. So, we have fallbacks. I don't think we have to pick any one specific plan, but with the proximity of the power station and the community choice need for, and PG&E need for more sustainable sources of power, means that we have ready customers for just about any level of power generation that we could put on this site. I did once, just as a mental exercise, do a back-of-the-envelope calculation to find out if the Baylands could provide all of the electricity for San Francisco, and unfortunately, even though it is 660 acres, it still falls quite short of that. But even if you covered the whole thing with solar panels. But I think it's really important in this day and age to support this sort of activity, and there's not a lot of areas nearby that have this sort of connection with a substation right next door. So that is wonderful. Finances and infrastructure, I only have a couple of points here. A lot of this is going to become more interesting after we make land use determinations and we get the financial reports. But there's a point in the general plan policy that we want to make a mix of uses for diversified economic base to maintain increased tax revenues. And I didn't quote the place, but there's another quote about saying that, with diverse uses, it allows things to be built up as market demands allow for it. And this has been a topic that has come up here a number of times with the phasing of the project, and what happens if we zone for a diverse mix of uses, but it's not economically viable for some of them to happen. The financial deliberations, I think, are going to be very interesting in that regard, because it could just be a cyclical thing. Well, if this wasn't built, then we need to go back to the drawing board and allocate more of that. And I don't know that would necessarily be beneficial. We did have an answer from staff in our last packet about ownership of liability, and of course, the legal counsel or the legal firm that wrote that up said you can't predict how any given ruling would come down, or acts of God, or so on and so forth, but they did say that UPC or its successor agencies would retain liability even after sale of the primary plot of land to individual homeowners, which of course would be a very difficult thing if you had 4,000 units and they all had to make an HOA to keep the containment system in place. That would be difficult for individuals to do. I don't know how much protection we have in terms of just relying on UPC or their successor agency, because any of these agencies can go out of business at any time. The quarry being a prime example, they were originally under agreement to restore the whole area to the condition it was in when they bought it, but somehow now it seems that there's not the funds to do that, and it's looking a lot less feasible, and who knows what will happen when they end operations, but they've just been dragging that out. So for an area this large, with concerns this large, over periods of time that are going to span decades, it seems a difficult thing to foresee what could happen in the future. So this is something we're going to have to discuss. The school district issue is also very interesting. Bayshore School District is separate from Brisbane School District. All of the Bayshore lands is in the Bayshore School District, so we don't have any overlap at all between the two at this point in time. There was discussion at one point in the past about merging the two school districts together, and that was brought up as a potential solution for their financial problems. But since the solution would have involved them closing one of their schools, the Bayshore School District did not want to do that. So we've remained separate. And they have not, the Bayshore School District has not submitted any commentary on this entire process. So, once we get into land use determinations, if there is anything that has to do with schools, they're perhaps going to have to be consulted. The other interesting thing is we did also get an answer in this most recent packet about where would be an acceptable location for a high school, and if you look only at the areas, if the only criteria you look at is the earthquake criteria, then Icehouse Hill is the only valid place for a high school because the rest of the site is subject to high liquefaction, which makes it ineligible for a public school. If you consider protected locations, Icehouse Hill is also protected, so we don't have a place that is currently acceptable for a school. Now the packet did make a point of saying that the school board could always make a statement of overriding concerns and say, hey, if there's housing right next door, then maybe it's also safe for us, and you can always override these recommendations, but it's something to be considered, whether that's a good idea. This was an interesting note in the sustainability framework that there may be wetlands restoration funding available, which I found interesting. And I put in a closing comment from OSAC that this project is too large to be absorbed by the San Francisco Bay Area. Certainly when I read the traffic section, I'm inclined to believe that the response in the DAR is that since we know that the traffic is going to be bad from the other building, that we might as well accept even worse traffic from any level of build out in the Baylands, but that is one of the closest modern parallels to the tragedy of the Commons that I've heard recently, where the solution to not enough grass to feed the cows was to add more cows. Going back to the Bart Map from the 50s, I think, there are ways that over time the capacity of this area can be increased, but I don't think we need to do it all at once. I think this could be more of a phased idea where we do some development now and get more data about how other similar sites are doing, and allow more uses over time as that information becomes more clear. So that's a lot of me talking. I didn't time myself. I'm guessing about an hour. I'm going to shut up now, and you guys can do your talking. The reason I did this is that there were certain important things that I wanted to call out and not just hit them linearly, but figure out what our primary goals are, and then from that start with the primary goals and fill in later. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Commissioner Anderson. So with that in mind, I'm going to review the guidelines and also the agreed upon process that we all received last week and discussed last week. So with that, in summary, basically the chair asked for the staff to provide a presentation. In this case, Commissioner Anderson shared his presentation with us. After the presentation, the commission asked the presenter to clarify questions. And when those questions have been asked and answered, the chair reminds the commission and members of the public that the public hearing has been closed. There will be no further input from the public at this point in the meeting, and the commission is in deliberation phase. Because the commission is not required to take any further public input at this point, permitting speakers is actually an additional way for us to include public input. But in fact, in fact, it actually expands the opportunity for public participation. The chair informs the commission that any commissioner who wants to speak must first be recognized. And once the commissioner is recognized, then they will speak for no more than 5 minutes in order to give opportunity for other commissioners to speak as well. In interest of time, the chair will determine the overall length of time. So if anyone in the audience is interested in speaking tonight to the issues that we are discussing in deliberations, each will be given 3 minutes, and we're asking that you fill out a public speaker card. So please take the next few minutes to do so. Turn the speaker cards into the staff, and we can estimate how much time we need to allot for that portion of the meeting. Okay, and there will be no rebuttals or debates. And after the speakers have spoken, the chair will allow further limited discussion to the commission that's not to exceed 15 minutes as we deliberate further. So that is the general process framework that we're going to work with. And I wanted to raise certain issues that we had discussed before to kind of put us all in the mindset of where we are now in terms of the deliberation process. So as you recall, last week we had the report prepared by the staff and the consultant for January 28th. And on page F.2.3, we all agreed on certain way to approach this and organize this. So essentially, there were no changes in the overall deliberation process previously outlined and recommended. It was agreed in the discussions that relevant planning and environmental policy issues would be organized by the general plan element, which in a sense was presented by the consultant last week, which is reflected in Commissioner Anderson's presentation today. So basically, it was I don't know if the staff can pull that up if you have it. If not, that's okay. I'll just read it off. And you can refer to that in the packet that you can find online, as well as you can ask for a DVD via staff. So essentially, we have 3 primary elements for the way we outline: the basic principles for development of the Baylands, which includes site values and features, planning and environmental goals, and sustainability. So as commissioner, I keep thinking professor, he speaks like a professor to me. Anyway, he's so thorough. But as he was speaking, I was pulling the slides along with him to kind of cite to certain areas that actually are applicable to the outline that we've all agreed to. So for instance, slides 24 and 25, they pertain to item number 1B, which would be planning environmental goals, right? So to the extent possible, we want to align ourselves with the agreed upon organizational process so that we can maintain the process integrity, transparency, thoroughness, impartiality that is our duties as commissioners to discharge to the public in any application. Number 2, appropriate mix and intensity of development within the Baylands. That includes land uses types, such as residential, retail, office, research, development, warehousing, and industrial uses, renewable energy generation, potential for ecology, expansion. So that would include slides such as 29, 71, 87, 88, 121. 2B, slides 29, 71, 87, 88, and 121. Yeah. Absolutely. And again, I think here is a distinction to be made is that while Commissioner Anderson presents this, there are slides that are going to fall into multiple categories, right? So, for instance, you're talking about the school district, you're talking about land uses as well as safety issues. So it can fall into both. So when we think about this, we really appreciate the fact that he took the time to put it together and present his process. But we also have to remember that each of the commissioners is beholden on each of us to go through our own independent analysis with the keeping in mind the frameworks that are set by not only City Council, but expressed as critical by our community, right? And so we need to make sure that every commissioner has equal opportunity to speak. And again, I want to remind the commissioners, and Commissioner Anderson has said this multiple times, is that we have the opportunity to present in any way we think would best show and share with the public our opinion and our thoughts and our analysis on this issue. So 2.C was appropriate intensity of land use. 3 is other policy considerations organized based on the general plan elements. A is land use, slides 71, 87, 88. 3B, transportation, slides 40, 41, 50. 3C, open space and conservation, slides 46, 48, and 86. And I'll send this to the staff as well, so you can access it if you want to follow along. 3D, safety, slides 17, 84, 85, 86, 93, 106, 109, and 121.
Okay, you have 17, 84, 85, what?
86, 93, 106, 109, and 121.
You'll get the email anyway.
Yeah, I'll email it for sure. 3E, which is housing. And specifically, I think that was a thread that went through most everything, but specifically the housing slide that was marked per Commissioner Anderson's identified deliberation slide was 109. 3F, other issues, which would include economic development, infrastructure, implementation, sustainability, would be slides 53, 79, 93, and 115. So again, we want to remind ourselves that at the stage we're at right now, we are first focusing on defining the basic planning and environmental principles that any future development of the Baylands must meet. So tonight we are not going to delve into the details because I think we were given a lot of food for thought, and we want to juxtapose that with the presentation that was provided by the consultant last week. And we want to align the ideas, and you should go home for yourselves and we should go home for ourselves and align those ideas and identify what other issues we feel need further clarification, further discussion, so on and so forth. And these principles would form the basis of any future land use recommendations, and any future developmental plans will need to integrate and reflect these principles. So with this in mind, we want to, any comments from the audience and any questions from the commissioners should be with the idea of clarifying and understanding the process and the general layout as it is aligned to the basic principles agreed upon. Okay? Okay, so commissioners, any questions for Commissioner Anderson? Okay.
You're looking at me all the time.
No. I'm looking at both ends.
I don't have all of the answers anyway. I think maybe more the focus right now is just, what other areas do we have to look at, or anything that was missing, or feedback, or your thoughts on the process.
I just want to make a little comment about the confusion as whether the city can have the more stringent standards than the state or federal. And I think you brought this up in the REP process also. And to my understanding, being in the regulatory business for a while, we can have the stringent standards than state or federal. So we don't have to comply. I mean, we can impose more stricter standards. City can. So in the REP process also, even though DTS is, the other agencies have the authorities, we can still have the more stringent standards than what they come up with. And regarding the traffic issues that you brought up, that subject, I will, when we come to that, I will discuss my thoughts on that. But in general, the traffic issue is not as simple as just running a one or two models. You have to look at the long-term impact on the traffic and also the capacity of roads and freeways and how that's going to affect the overall congestion issue. And that in general can also turn into an effect on the safety and human health. So when we come to that point, I will probably discuss a little bit more on that. And also the construction impacts, that's also a big one. You mentioned a little bit about the noise issues, and noise is also will be a paramount concern also, because the reason is will go on for such a long time. So when we look at the impact itself, we really have to set certain guidelines as to what times they can do what activities. Same thing with the drilling process and all of that, how that's going to impact the water quality, impact the wildlife, also the spread of the pollutants like toxic gases and toxic materials. But that has to be analyzed, and that will be discussed in detail. I will, at that time, give my views. And I must commend you for going through a lot of, you spend a lot of time to prepare this, and it does give us a starting point to go over and think about various things that you mentioned here. And it's quite possible that during the process we may come up with some things that we are missed here, but this is a damn good effort, and I thank you very much for doing that. It will help all of us.
There's something that has come to mind, and I did a little research and saw one article in the Examiner a couple of weeks ago. I wanted to know what impact on housing in San Francisco is being made by short-term rentals. I saw anything from 360 units to 10,000 units. And I don't know how to collect that information. One of the studies, I just can't figure it out. I don't even know how to begin to figure it out. And I think that should be part of the discussion. If we are moving in the direction of people swapping out their rooms because they can't meet the mortgage to have short-term rentals rather than roommates, then the shortage is never going to end. And I think that needs to be configured with what's going on with housing in the Bay Area. How much is that making an impact on the shortage of housing as compared to some of the other shortages, such as a lot of people want to work here, and set businesses up. How much? So that's one thing that I did some research, didn't come up with anything that looked at all like it had really been a good survey. I don't know what to say, but I keep pondering that issue. I know people are suffering, they need more housing. If we take away the chances for housing, you know, there's like how many universities in this local area, and no potential for students to rent if they are not going to be allowed to because, you know, we want to use this for a short-term rental. And I see that all the time, and I was hearing it. So that was one thought I had. And I don't think there's any solution. I'm sure there's other things, but I did want to talk about that one at this very moment.
Okay, so again, we will talk about the details as they come up. Anything else in terms of the general framework that we have agreed to?
I think it's tough to stay in the general framework because if I go through,
hard.
well, first, again, it's an excellent organizational tool, so I appreciate you doing this for us, and it actually helped me kind of restructure and redefine my comments and how I've been trying to organize them and put them in different bins. As far as questions, I mean, I have lots of affirmatives, and I don't have all my notes here, so I went through it again as you're speaking, and I have at least 25 or 30 thumbs ups. So I won't go through all of those, but the only questions or maybe general comment I had is there's a few instances like noise mitigation, you know, where we can actually step back and where the research of alternatives and additional research is necessary instead of just accepting the standard, you know, pile driving. Like when the owner was up, I actually asked a question about alternatives. There's alternative methods to pile driving that cost more, which produce a lot less noise, and I wanted to investigate, you know, how those costs could be absorbed, and if the owner was potentially in agreement with, you know, taking some of those costs, bearing some of those costs. So I think looking at some alternative methods, and I'm sure the owner has, and a lot of, you know, technology has changed a lot and is continually changing. So I think that's we need to step back in a few of these instances to see what alternative methods are available, and that also comes down to what Commissioner Munier mentioned with the transportation. It's a very, very complex component of this, which I think is going to require a lot of meticulous kind of investigation and time, because it affects not only you know, the traffic issue in itself, but the health and happiness, the culture of Brisbane, the connectivity, you know, all of that we talked about. Transportation is that, you know, to me a big, like, at the heart of this development. So those are. So I don't have any questions per se, but those were some of my comments on some of the key issues. Noise, vibration, yeah. So I think that's most of what I have to comment at this time. Thank you.
And so, as Commissioner Reinhardt was saying, it's a really useful organizational tool, and it also allowed me to provide a sort of a comparative analysis with the way I would approach things, or any one of us would approach it, given the fact that each of us has a different analytical process, right? So when I was looking at it, and just again, these are from the slides that were identified by you as the deliberation slides, and where it falls, there are some areas that either are so pervasive that it's almost every slide, or not pervasive enough that I would like more detail. So I was thinking I would love to have more discussion on the site values, site features, sustainability, although that runs through the entire gamut of the discussions. The distribution of the land uses would be something I would like to delve into in more detail, and the intensity of the land uses. I think the slides identify that, but again, at the level we're at right now, we really can't talk about the intensity and the distribution without going into the details that would allow us to actually determine that going back up, sort of like backtracking to decide what and where and when and how. And so those are some of my comments. Again, I don't have any questions at this moment, but I'm reserving that for later as well.
I want to add one more concern, and that's a very important one for all of us. This particular EIR, you can see that it doesn't meet the general plan. So the central question is, are we going to go ahead with this, or are we going to decide what needs to be done to bring it in compliance with the general plan? Also, process-wise, we should have looked at the general plan amendment first, then look at the specific EIR, which we didn't do. So that will be something that we all have to think about and come up with our position on that as to how to proceed. This is a central issue here, As I said earlier, is cart before the horse. Are we going to accept that? That's a central question we all have to answer.
Can I ask you a question? You've said this many times, but I don't understand, since the plan has 5 different aspects, one that has not been studied as much as the others, and that is the alternative Krebel plan. Mm-hmm. But it was alluded to. How are we making an overview that it's not meeting the general plan? I mean, what part of it are we talking about? Are we talking about? And that's why I'm confused about what.
There are a lot of areas where we know that the specific plan submitted by the developer does not meet the general plan. Right? There are a number of areas where it doesn't meet the general plan. First, foremost is housing. General plan doesn't allow that.
Okay, but there's 3 sections that don't include housing.
Yeah, I know, but I'm just saying that here we had to deliberate on the approval of or acceptance of the EIR, right?
But
and
what you're saying, I'm sorry, I'm just so confused about what you're saying. I need some more clarification. You're saying because one section says housing, then we should not accept the other 3 sections? That's why I'm confused.
No, what I'm saying is that the one particular, plan does not meet the general plan. Should we discard that? Don't think about that at all because it's not meeting the general plan. Or we should come up with a recommendation that we should amend the general plan in order to give the equal justice to that particular plan also. Or we should automatically say that this particular plan meets the general plan requirements, so this will be an acceptable alternative.
But then again, I really respect what you're saying. It's just that I fundamentally don't understand what you're saying. I
don't know how.
What I'm saying, no. This is what my question is. If we are saying that we should not accept parts that are not in the general plan, wouldn't that be putting? Well, then I do.
I'm not saying. All I'm saying is that we all have to determine that are we going to accept the fact that this particular plan does not meet the general plan, and is it acceptable to us, or should we discard this plan because it doesn't meet the general plan?
I think
so. That's the idea we all have to discuss. And okay. Some of you may say that it's okay to proceed with it, and we will do the general plan amendment later on. Some of us will say that no, it doesn't meet the general plan, so we cannot look at this particular plan. But however, plan number 2, 3, 4, they do meet the general plan, so there may be an acceptable way. I don't know.
Staff?
Just one point of clarification. I understand where Commissioner Munir is headed. I just want to again put into the record that part of the applicant's request is to amend the general plan to make the specific plan consistent with the general plan. That's a decision before the Planning Commission.
Yes.
That's a choice you get to make. But again, they have that right to make that application. They've made that application. You have the obligation to consider it. You know, what decision you make, that's your prerogative, but that certainly is on the table before you as part of this process.
And that's what I was trying to say, that this will be a central issue that we had to think about, you know, as to how to go about doing that.
Yeah, and I was just going to, I wanted to let you discuss that as part of the deliberations, but I wanted to remind everyone that for clarification, the deliberation process allows for 3 possible outcomes, and that's listed again on F2.2 of last week's of paperwork, and it says here that essentially, again, that we recommend approval of applicant's proposal, which requests the general plan amendments and specific plans, or we can recommend denial of UPC's proposed specific plan and general plan amendment and recommend no further action, or 3, recommend approval of updated general plan land use programs and policies. So, and it goes into further detail about how to,
What was the third one you mentioned?
Recommend approval of updated general plan, land use programs and policies.
And there should be number 4 also, that we can accept any of the other alternate plan. That should be an option also.
Well, that would be a part, I'm assuming that would be part of the modification that we're always
No, it's not
allowed to.
modification of the update plan. What I'm saying is that, for example, we go with a plan that meets all the general plan requirements, and we can accept that also. So there should be one of the alternate also.
Well,
It's missing in there.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. If you want to recommend one of the concept plans or alternatives or
Yeah.
whatever out of the EIR, that's certainly, I think it was intended to be covered under number 3, alternative plans,
that's
policies, et cetera.
how I read it
Yes,
as well.
absolutely, you could.
I think
you could,
that should be corrected.
Sure, we
Well,
can
I-
make
I
that point
actually
clear in the
think
record.
I agree with her.
Yeah, the way I read it, there's room for a different interpretation, but the way I read it was this recommendation could be based on any of the plans, variants, alternatives analyzed in the DIR, which we have discussed. And so I felt that that was broad enough, but if it makes further, if it provides further
I think it should be
clarification, we can just specifically cut that portion out and make it, option number 4, which would be literally stating that, any variants, alternatives analyzed in the DIR would be a recommendation that we can make as well. So that way we can just point simply to recommendation number 4. But I guess for others of us, we found that sufficient. But that's fine. We can break that down.
Is that all right with everyone else?
Is that okay?
Yes, whatever helps.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would like that.
So I'll put that down as recommendation number 4.
Did you have some other recommendations?
No, not at this time.
No, I think it covers all
It
possible
covers that part that I was
choices
interested in.
that we can make in terms of how we can recommend it to City Council.
Yeah.
So,
And also the further down that line that we have the option to reject the EIR.
well, that's the denial.
That's denial,
Yes.
right? But reject the EIR, but accepting a concept plan rather than a specific plan. And concept plan has to be further studied, because if the developer's plan is a specific plan is not specific enough, right? There are a lot of things that are missing in that plan that needs further investigation. We can ask that too, that a specific plan should be revisited.
And that would be under variance, which would be recommendation 4. Right?
I guess, it's indirectly.
Or a combination of elements of multiple alternatives, variants incorporated into a single concept. So I think that would,
Yeah, I think those are all, when you get to the point of, if you come up with a preferred land use scenario, or general plan policies or programs or whatever it is you end up wanting to recommend, and you start testing that against the EIR, and either you're comfortable that the EIR adequately addresses that or you're not, and that's, again, part and parcel to your recommendation to the City Council. At that point, I don't know, the idea of upfront trying to sort of determine what those potential outcomes or alternatives might be. I think that's when you get to your land use sort of point and you need to determine what your CEQA kind of conclusions are, then we can work that through.
Yeah. Well, first of all, we have to agree with that the EIR is adequate enough, addresses all the issues.
Commissioner, I think what the planning director is saying is that whether you believe the EIR is adequate to cover whatever recommendation you eventually make down the road, that's the point at which you'd consider EIR adequacy.
No.
Considering EIR adequacy up front, if there's no land use recommendation that you've arrived at, there's really no way to determine whether the EIR would be adequate for that particular recommendation. The EIR is not a land use approval. It's not an entitlement. It's simply an evaluation of the physical impacts of whatever project you might wish to approve. So it really logically comes later, that evaluation of adequacy.
That's exactly what I was saying, that EIR, we have to look at the adequacy based on the analysis that was done. They adequately analyze the, say, for example, traffic impact. And we think that they did not. There are certain things that are missing. Same thing with the other elements of the EIR. If we think that there is more data needed, then we can say go back and do this. This EIR is not up to par at this point.
You could certainly do that.
That's allowable under CEQA.
Yes, you could certainly make that recommendation to the City Council.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have 2 speaker cards. So we have a motion to open it up to public comment, please.
I make a motion to open the public hearing or public comments.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Ms. Miller?
Good evening. Anya Miller, Brisbane.
Good evening.
President.
Is the
John?
It should be on. I think I hear you,
I
but
think it just needs to be tweaked
Lift
over
it up.
closer to you.
there you go.
For those of us who have been struggling with this big project and all the documentation so far, I think Commissioner Anderson's presentation was wonderful to hear, and I hope a lot of people at home also heard it, that begin to understand all the complexities and the job that you people have to do for us. And we really appreciate your doing what you're doing and the thoroughness that you approach the very, very difficult thing. I just have a few questions, if I may. I heard a reference to a wind study, and I think it has to do with the windsurfing conditions and a study needed for that. But I did want to remind you that there is a wind study as far as the volume of strength of the wind that was done early on for Krebel with the developers' funding, actually. And city conducted a year and a half. We have data, we have computer data, and the result is known what the average wind, what the energy producing wind would be, and it is better for low wind turbines. My next question has to do with timing. And you are under great pressure to finish this massive job within a couple of months here, and I just have a very hard time understanding how you could possibly do that. But there are things that I wonder where in your process the timing of, for instance, the Recology expansion, that's supposed to have its own EIR, right? And so where is that? When is that coming? And how are you going to consider that? Are you going to wait for it or accelerate some sort of determination of what they want exactly, and EIR on that? And are you going to deal with that EIR? So that's a question. And the next has to do with the fiscal analysis. I've heard many mentions of how can you start making any recommendations without knowing the financials. And I understand there really should be three of them. One is the developers, analysis, benefit, cost, profit, etc. And the second is the cities. What does it mean in municipal finance for us? Various, again, scenarios. I guess they'd have to cover a lot. The third one would be then the externalities and the sustainability kind of fiscal analysis. What are the two true costs of building and or not, or some alternatives that might be saving significant costs, future costs in health, greenhouse gas emissions, health and safety, all those things that have costs if they don't happen. So that analysis is called ecological economics, actually. Has been referred to. I think Council has agreed to go with that, and it's not easy to find adequate professionals for that. But I do hope that you absolutely require that too. And in that, actually, and I don't know where it would come, maybe in a city analysis, is some attention to our property values as homeowners and business owners here in existing Brisbane. But for instance, if you have 20 years of noise and an absolutely impossible traffic situation, congestion, what's going to happen to our property values? Living here and having invested in this community, that figure, those kind of figures should be considered. Mm-hmm. And I've heard, and I'm glad to hear this mention of different things that you don't have. You're calling for this and that. And I would suggest for you to, as you come into an area where you know you want more research, you know you want more studies done, that you absolutely make a note of that, make a record of that particular study, so that then you can cumulatively start developing a list of further studies. So you have a bulk of new studies needed before you can make any EIR determinations. That I fully agree that comes later. First you have to set the land use, and then look at the general plan, look at the EIR, would it work? And of course, if you're talking about the alternatives like the Credible plan, it is a concept plan. And so who's going to do the specific plan on that? That too may be a fiscal issue. Who's going to do that? I ask.
Could you say that again?
Specific plan for the...
Yeah.
Well, who's going to do...
The renewable energy alternative at this point is simply a concept plan. And we have asked you, and when we made our presentation to you, the bottom line is this is just a concept. It does not have infrastructure. It does not have what kind exactly, how many million square feet of this and that. It is simply a concept, and it needs beefing up to be a specific plan that you can then look at the EIR, is it adequate? So it's not ready, and so that's another thing. Who's going to do it and when? Those are my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll keep that in mind. Mr. Diaz?
Good evening, Honorable Planning Commission. I'm Joel Diaz. Just would like to thank Commissioner Greg Anderson for that presentation. That was really organized, and I was appreciate it greatly. And equally appreciate all of your hard work in analyzing this. I know it's a big project and a big proposal before you, and there's a lot to consider. And, specifically under the principles here and the guideline that's been put forth by the Planning Commission to everyone, regarding the general plan amendment and the idea that the applicant has the right to ask for a general plan amendment and consideration of that, that all sounds fine and good. I think that we are definitely providing them a reasonable consideration of a general plan amendment. But I think that we also need to reasonably consider the possibility that the general plan will not be amended. And we have in our possession a survey that was recently done that does not support housing anywhere close to the proposed numbers, and maybe not at all. We do have 3 council members that have said that they adamantly oppose housing on the Baylands. That's 3 out of 5, which is a majority. So I don't think it's a reasonable expectation to believe that the general plan is going to be successfully amended. I think the consideration has been provided. I think you guys have been very open-minded about it. But, it's very similar to maybe a violent prisoner who comes up for parole. You're going to give them consideration of paroling them, but if they're depending on their crimes and how violent they are, they probably are not going to be paroled. They are getting that consideration, but it's not going to happen. The general plan is you are giving the consideration that the general plan could be amended, but probably very unlikely to happen given the results of the survey and the very strong position of 3 council members. And clearly it is not permitted under the current general plan. The other, in terms of the EIR and certifying the EIR, it seems there are a lot of holes, and so there needs to be some modifications. There are a few things that have to be addressed. The water, for example. There were several other concerns, and I'm sure you will choose which ones potentially need to be modified. I do agree with Anya Miller that we definitely need some financial information here, because this whole thing hinges on that. And in terms of having overriding conditions, economically speaking, it would be nice to know what we're talking about. Is this going to be a financial liability to the city, or is this going to be enough of a revenue win for us that it makes sense? And I have no idea, based on the information presented, how that's going to work out. And I think that's a critical piece that's missing. In terms of sustainability and the sustainability framework that the council has suggested that we use in evaluating this project, it seems to me that this specific plan, as proposed, completely violates some of the major tenets of that sustainability framework. Number one, and I think the biggest problem for me in looking at that, is the water issue. The specific plan suggests that the water that has been negotiated is not enough to sustain the entire development. And that's a problem. And there's not enough water purchased or negotiated to sustain the entire development. And that's a problem. And the sustainability framework clearly states that in using this one planet model, that we as Brisbane want to sort of be a blueprint for the rest of the world, so that when they consider proposals, that they sort of copy us and look at all of the good things we are doing. And I think that it flies in the face of that goal to design, to sort of literally design a project that doesn't have enough water to sustain it. Now, if everybody in the world did the same exact thing, we would have a huge problem, right? And that's the opposite of sustainability. We should be designing around a sustainable amount of water use, not just right off the bat say, well, this whole project is bigger than the amount of water that we have for it. And not even, that's a problem. It's contrary to the sustainability framework. So is the traffic impact. Also very contrary to the sustainability framework. The level of service is already exceeded. And this project is going to make that much, much worse, which is also the opposite of sustainability. So these are really big conflicts. And if we're supposed to use the sustainability framework, it really limits what could be approved, in my mind. In other words, it has to be sustainable. In terms of more about the water, the sustainability framework talks about recycling water and capturing gray water and non-potable water and reusing it. And it sounds like a great idea in any normal situation, but as soon as you mix in the idea of cross-contamination and all of the contamination that exists out there, that seems like a pretty dangerous task. And it seems like something that needs to be monitored, because we wouldn't want cross-contamination from recycling water to go on out there for years and years potentially, whether it's from Kinder Morgan tanks that's causing the contamination or from the landfill dump. And if we're relying on that as a source of sustainability in conserving water, I think that's very problematic. So water is a really critical issue. I think that needs to be looked at further. And my last point is this, is that we have before us a superior proposal, a superior alternative, which is the Renewable Energy Plan, which is feasible and has been identified as such, superior and feasible. And according to the letter from the attorney, according to CEQA, we are prohibited from approving any developer proposal when we have a superior alternative before us. And the way that you reject that superior alternative is to come up with these overriding conditions. And that's not the exact terminology, but you have to have these overriding findings. And I don't know where those overriding findings are going to come from when we don't have any financial information to determine the economics, when it's contradictory to the sustainability framework, when we don't have the water in hand, when we haven't done an EIR for the water and where it's coming from, when we have a conflict with the general plan. It seems to me that this can only go one way, which is to deny the developer proposal, approve the superior alternative, and to modify the EIR. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Prem-Long?
Good evening, Chairperson Doe and Commissioners Prem-Long.
Evening.
Brisbane resident and homeowner. This is just pretty basic. I didn't see it referenced in the presentation, and I think that one of the issues that also needs to be considered is safety with regard to underground pipelines. The one example is the PG&E pipeline that's running under Bayshore Boulevard and the explosion that happened in San Bruno. We need to take something like that into consideration in building in that area. And then also Kinder Morgan has pipelines running beneath the bay. So before anything is built, I think there needs to be a lot of specific research done as to what possible effects explosions or earthquakes or what have you could have on those pipelines and upon any potential development in that area. I think it's pretty concise, and that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Okay. So could we have a motion to close public comments, please?
Again, I make the motion to close the public hearing. Public comments, I guess.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay. So with that, we will be discussing further scheduling for the special meetings that pertain to Baylands. But now we move on to items initiated by the staff.
I don't have anything this evening.
Okay. Items initiated by the commission? Subcommittee updates or anything? Not that I'm aware. Okay. So, could we have a motion to adjourn to the regular meeting of February 11th?
Should I make the motion again to adjourn?
Go ahead.
The February, what's the date there?
February 11th.
February 11 meeting.
I'll again second.
Okay. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Thank you and good night.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.